gonna put myself on mute and stay. Sorry, you're gonna see my little box because I'm afraid to leave.
No worries. Yes. All right, I'm back. All right. Do you, Jacqueline, you know folks have to log back in since I disconnected, or are they here still? I see a couple of attendees. Okay.
They should still be
Apologies to anyone. All right. Apologies to anyone that was here and saw me disappear. I got booted out and I couldn't get back in, but I am here now. So we'll just kind of power through since we took a couple minutes to figure out that. Thank you for your patience.
Brittany, can you hit record real quick? My apologies, I can't do it since I made you host.
Sure.
Thanks.
We're recording.
Yay.
Great. Okay. So as I was saying, if you were with me before I lost connectivity, my name is Brittany. I work with Columinate. I'm a consultant who specializes in operations and financial improvement. Maybe you've had a chance to attend some other Columinate consultant sessions as part of this conference, but we are a co-op of co-op consultants. And my area of expertise is really based in like the nitty-gritty details of operations and finance. I work mostly with co-ops that are already open, but I do work with some startups. But that context for my experience is that I'm often brought in to work with a client when a project has gone off track. So I've had a lot of perspective or insight, or gotten to have a lot of insight into the risks or the opportunities to kind of get off of the right path when we're in startup mode, both right before the doors open, maybe when we're in construction, and after the doors open. And when Jacqueline and I were talking about this session, we were both kind of like ruminating on this period of time being a really challenging period of time for startup co-ops, because there's so much happening and there's so much going on. And the stakes are really, really high, right? Like we are trying to see if this thing can get off the ground and work. So that's the context for this conversation today, is looking at how the Pro Forma can help guide your co-op through this period and beyond your first year towards long-term vitality and sustainability. I'm not the super nitty-gritty detailed Pro Forma expert. That's my colleague, Don Moffitt, who you might have seen presenting some other sessions at this conference. But my perspective is going to be more holistic on how we're leveraging the Pro Forma as a tool for success. Do feel free to interact in the chat panel. Ask any questions as I go. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Zoom chat panel, so do feel free to jump in there at any point in time. So we're going to talk about what's at stake during these early phases of the project, specifically right before, maybe like 6 months before opening, when we're spending money on our Performa, and right after. What are the common pitfalls to avoid, and what are some potential strategies to keep us on track? All right. So I thought it would be helpful to start with an overview of the 3 stages, which is I was going to say invented, but was pioneered by my late great colleague, Bill Gessner, with support of some other folks. And essentially, if you've heard all these acronyms at the conference, 2A, 3B, 3C, we've broken down the startup process into really digestible bites of stages. So the organizing stage, maybe some of you are still here, is where our vision is congealing and coming into place. And then stage 2, we get into feasibility and planning. Here is where the Performa initially shows up. In stage 2A, feasibility generally starts with a market study. Market study helps us understand the sales potential of our vision, our business idea, and where that business is going to exist. What sort of sales might we expect? And then the rest of the financial picture is really built around your sales potential. So generally this starts with a market study and then goes to a pro forma. What the pro forma does in the feasibility stage is take our projected sales and our vision and flesh it out into like an incredibly complex budget with a lot of moving parts that tells us whether this vision with sales in mind is feasible or not feasible. And it does that by weighing together all of the financial activities and implications of our project. Today, what I really want to drive home is that the Performa does not end in stage 2A. It doesn't start there and end there. From stage 2A feasibility, the Performa serves as the guide for every other stage of your project. So in stage 2B, we get into some of the nitty-gritty planning. Maybe we're getting some preliminary locations for our project hammered down. Maybe we're looking at construction estimates. We're starting to pull together some numbers or a rough timeline. All of that information goes back into the Performa to get it as accurate as possible. But at this stage, a lot of what's in the Performa are best guess assumptions, right? It's like what we are planning to spend, what we are planning to raise, what we are planning to accomplish in sales, and then we update it throughout the rest of our project, incorporating reality into those best guess assumptions that we've made. So if you walk out of this session with only one thing, let it be that the Performa rules all. It guides every decision your organization makes beyond the 2A stage. So yes, feasibility looked positive, we're going to move forward. And every stage beyond that is done through the limitations and the context of this Performa document. I have to give credit to my colleague Jeannie, who's on the line, for finding this awesome cartoon. I've been using it in a lot of budgeting trainings. I think it's an apt visualization for what the Performa does for your business. On the left-hand side here, we see a guy moseying down the street, not a care in the world. Maybe he doesn't even have a Performa, or maybe he has a Performa, but he's in a drawer somewhere. He made it, he got it done, and then he never looked at it again. So this gentleman does not know the hazards that are on his path. He doesn't see them, and he has no framework set up to avoid them. In the center here, we see it's a little bit better. Now we've defined some of the hazards or some of the framework of limitations around our project. We've at least named them. Maybe this is naming how much cash we need, or naming the sales we need, or how much the project is going to cost. We have some signposts, but there is still the chance that our friend here could slip and fall in that proverbial manhole. So all the way on the right-hand side, we would say this is a co-op that has a really well vetted, solid Performa budget, and they're using it to establish safety net around their business. If you are on track from your Performa, your business is at risk. So the limitations or the expectations set in your budget ensure both that you've identified potential risks, that you've identified what metrics you need to be successful, and that you've established some sort of safety net, right? So we don't slip and fall in the hole. We're all on the same page. We know what the risks are, and we're not going down there no matter what. And full incorporation of the Performa into your planning and launch process will get you over here on the good side of the comic and away from, the risky place where we could slip and fall and not even see it coming. So if you aren't familiar with what a Performa is, I do get asked this question quite often in my line of work. It's just a big old budget with a lot of parts. Generally speaking, a Performa is used for a large capital project, and it's much more detailed than what we might think of when we hear the word budget. Maybe when we hear the word budget, we're just thinking of operating budget, income and expense. There's some additional moving parts to a project Performa. So why do we need it? Beyond not wanting to fall in the manhole, it helps us assess our financial feasibility. So does this project work? And do we end up being a long-term sustainable business based on what we know? You will need it in order to get capital. I think I can fairly say every bank is going to require you to have a Performa that demonstrates your business plan will allow you to repay your loan. So the bank considers the feasibility of your Performa sort of insurance policy, that they're going to get their investment in you back as long as you hit all of these targets. So the Performa defines how much debt we have and what financial requirements might come with that debt. It determines how much you can spend on building out and opening your store. Believe it or not, I've had clients who started designing their dream store and spending money before getting a Performa to figure out how much they could reasonably spend. It determines how much cash you need to open with. You will notice I have need in bold because the amount of cash your business will need in the bank before you open is really non-negotiable, right? Maybe you can get into it with your Performa professional and move some stuff around and tweak it, but generally speaking, this is a non-negotiable number. The success of your Performa 1 year and multiple years down the line is contingent upon opening with the right amount of cash in the bank. It's so critical and it's so easy for things to get out of control, right? And spend more than we thought we were going to spend in the maybe 3 to 6 months before opening. So keep in mind that that is really important, that we have the right amount of money. And then lastly, but definitely not least, is that the Performa doesn't stop being useful when the doors open. In fact, now is when the Performa becomes really critically important. I mean, it's important all along, but this is the make or break moment where we figure out, were we right in our guesses about feasibility of our project? And so while this might seem intuitive, I've seen enough clients sort of put the Performa to the side once the doors open that it is worth saying the Performa is critically important to look at against reality once the store opens, absolutely in the first year and beyond into multiple years after your first year anniversary. So what are the pieces of a Performa that are different than like a simple budget? One of them is a sources and uses document. Don't copy this because they're made up numbers. I've sort of extrapolated this from a template that my colleague Don has made. And this tells us everything we're going to need to spend to open our store and exactly where it's going to come from. So this is the real critical startup piece that we're monitoring before the doors open. So this is a budget that your project manager, your general manager, probably your board are watching like hawks up until store opening, because it's typically here where things start to get off track with timelines and construction costs and cause the co-op to open undercapitalized. So it's so critical that we're monitoring these expenses and cash inflow so that we can open on a good enough, strong enough footing to be long-term successful. Other things that are in a Performa are all of our debt forecasted out into the next couple of years, up to like 10 years. How much interest we owe, principal, and what the payback schedule for that debt is going to be. These are critically important factors because we need all the puzzle pieces to fit. We need to have enough cash in the bank and or generate enough cash from operating your business to pay down our debt on time. And it's become common enough with startups, I could say it's a theme, that folks find themselves having to restructure debt or think about debt timing or debt payment after opening because they've burned through some cash. And now the plan they had to pay back their debt needs to be reevaluated. So we really want to make sure that all those puzzle pieces fit together. Other things that are in your Performa are projected financial statements for your business. So we have these 3 key statements. Income statement, I will call this the pulse of your business. How much profit is being generated from running your store? Balance sheet, you might call this the full physical on your health. It is the cumulative impact of everything. Your profitability, your debt, all of the pre-opening spending that happened. It tells us how you are doing holistically as a business. Are you on solid ground? And then most importantly, you could argue, is your cash flow. The number one risk in opening a new business is running out of cash, and cash flow is projected out in your Performa for multiple years. showing us how much cash we anticipate coming from earnings or profit and how much cash will be going out to pay all the debt we took on to finance the creation of our new business. So what's in the balance sheet, just as like do a real quick overview of some of this stuff. How much stuff do we have or will we have, including that critical metric of cash? How much do we own now and long term, critically important? And how much equity, what is the owner's net stake in the business? How much equity have we raised? We can see how liquid our business will be or is as we track the pro forma. Can we pay our bills? That first year of opening, it is so critical that you are in growth mode. And there is nothing that kills growth mode more than having to cut back. We can't pay on marketing. We have to cut back on staff. We have to cut back on all the fun stuff that generates excitement. So we really want to make sure we have enough liquidity to pay our bills. We want to make sure that we have taken on the right amount of debt for the income we anticipate being generated by our business. The Performa figures this stuff out, and you have a professional help you, so we don't have to figure it out. It's based in data and in industry metrics that have a lot of bearing to them. We don't want to be underwater. There are stories of startup co-ops that have gotten underwater in the first couple of years, and we want to make a U-turn and go in the other direction where we're building the strength of our business, not depleting it. And then, of course, will we have enough cash? And if not, when does that cash run out? That is what the pro forma will tell you. So the pro forma indicates positive feasibility when you have enough cash long-term to run the business based on projections. Once you open, reality might not match the pro forma. And updating it answers the question, are we going to have enough cash to run the business? And if the answer is no, it tells you what the gap is that you really need to either raise or to figure out how to reduce cash burn in other areas. I thought this comic was funny. I hope it doesn't offend anyone. It's a little dark, but I promise this will be inspiring at the end. I heard my colleague Jade say one time that people think opening the store is Everest, but it's actually base camp. And this comic is a very apt description of that, in that there's so much blood, sweat, tears, grassroots organizing that goes into opening the store that it can feel like the finish line is opening the store. But in reality, the finish line is meeting your pro forma metrics for sales and net income in the first year. You could argue that it's in the first few years, but that first year is so critical to making sure you get to the real summit of Everest, which is a long-term, financially feasible, sustainable, viable business model. So once we open the doors, you are, in my mind, still in feasibility stage. You're still trying to understand the assumptions that were in the pro forma match the reality of what happens once the doors are open. And again, feel free to drop some comments in the chat if you have any questions. I'm only watching the chat in Zoom, so if you're in the chat on Pathable, I will not see it, FYI. Okay, so Performa is a giant monster spreadsheet. Why do we need this level of detail? Maybe you come from a different industry, or you have other people on your board or different backgrounds where you're like, this level of detail seems overkill. My mantra that comes up time and time again when I'm talking about profitability and performance is that grocery stores, grocery co-ops, you're essentially running a 1% profit margin business. It is incredibly difficult to run a 1% profit margin business. It means there's just simply not a lot of room for error. Therefore, every single piece and financial condition has to be considered and monitored, because it's really easy to get off track, right? We only have a 1% buffer between making money and burning cash from operations. It's another reason why It requires a level of professional management and experience, both at the operations level and at the board level, to have really strong systems for monitoring the Performa and the financial results, because margin is very, very thin. Here's a super quick visualization of what that thin margin looks like. When I say margin, I'm talking about the profitability from running the business. So what is this? Is this business going to get us piles of cash or what? This is a pretty standard representation of what an average co-op might get, although your picture might be slightly different. So it's just an example. For every dollar that comes in the register, you could anticipate spending 63 cents on cost of goods, just the product that you sold, which leaves you with a margin, a gross margin of 37 pennies. But that's not all. We have other stuff to pay. Next, we want to pay our staff. We want to pay them good. We want there to be a living wage. We want there to be benefits. Let's say that comes to, let's see. Yeah, that comes to 23% in this example, which leaves us with only 14 pennies after cost of goods and personnel to pay all of our other bills. And there are other bills. We have the expense of being in our building, our administrative support, our operating expenses, marketing. Maybe if you're a board that's so lucky to get a stipend, we pay something for our board or board development, attending conferences. All said and done, that leaves us with 2 pennies. But there's more. So your bank definitely wants the interest on their loan. This is also where the Performa is critically important. If it turns out you have higher debt interest than can be supported by your sales, you're going to find there's not any pennies left on the bottom line, and we might be burning some cash trying to keep up with the interest payments on our debt. Uncle Sam definitely also wants his penny. So once your business gets out of the gritty startup phase, at best, if you're a grocery co-op, you can anticipate 1%, maybe 1 to 2% or 2 pennies on each dollar that comes into your business. So it is really important that we have a well-vetted financial plan that we're paying attention to, because there's not a lot. Any variation in our expenses or our income might mean there's no pennies. And for nearly all startups, you're actually going to be generating negative pennies when you first open, meaning that you need cash to subsidize the running of your business until your operation matures, meaning that staff are trained, we are done with our expensive marketing blitz, we've grown sales month over month and are growing sales into maturity. We are going to plan to burn some cash in operations for the first couple months or first year, or potentially longer, depending upon your specific situation. So the initial Performa is based on some assumptions. The assumption is that you're going to have experienced professional management. I'll say that your market study is also based on some assumptions, but I won't get into that. But assumptions like, you're going to have a good sign outside, people are going to be able to find you, etc. The Performa assumes that you're going to have accurate, up-to-date financial information and strong accounting systems from the minute your doors open. That's a high bar. We'll talk about that in some more detail. The Performa assumes you're not going to have significant cost overruns or time delays. Most Performas have a little bit of a construction overrun or project overrun built into them. But if we find that there are big cost overruns or long time delays that cause extra expense, we need to update the plan, right? The initial assumption is that that doesn't happen. Some of your peers can tell you it does happen, and it has happened to some startup co-ops. Most Performas, as I said, predict negative pennies or negative net income in the early stages of the business, so that we are spending those pennies to run the store, not generating pennies by running the store. I worked with a co-op, to not be named, who had A volunteer helped them with the initial creation of the Performa. They projected a $200,000 profit in the first year of their startup. They had a big surprise at the end of that first year because they definitely did not profit. So it's not common to generate a profit in the first year. And then most importantly, that you're going to open the store with enough working capital. That is critically important to the first year success and beyond of your business. And you are really shooting your GM in the foot, so to speak, if you let that store open without enough cash in the bank. They will have to make difficult decisions right away, right, about how to run the business. And it really puts a damper on the potential for long-term sales growth. Again, if you're from another industry, you might have different experience with how much working capital is needed to run a business, etc. But I can tell you that grocery stores need a lot of cash to function. They have the potential to burn cash really quickly. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars in 1 month. I'm working with a client that burned $80,000, last month. That's real. So you can burn cash very quickly. And the potential to build cash is 1 to 2 pennies on the dollar. That is why having strong financial management is so important. We need a lot to function. We just need it in the bank to function. We can burn a lot quickly, and it's going to take a long time to build it. If we need to, especially if we're in crisis, it can take a long time. So what do we need that opening capital for? Why is it so critical that we open with the right amount of money in the bank? Well, as I said, you're not going to make money right out the gate. So it subsidizes your operation until it matures enough to make a profit. It gives you time to course correct. If we don't hit sales, or say construction goes over budget, or things aren't matching, reality isn't matching with what we thought it was, it gives you time, essentially. It gives you security against disruption. So the industry benchmark, and the caveat being that it's going to be different for everybody's unique situation, is to not have less than 10 days cash on hand at any time as a grocery business. 10 days cash on hand is equivalent to your average daily cash expense, your bank account divided by that average daily cash expense. Yeah, I can't see the chat, Jacqueline. So if people are asking me questions, I only see Jacqueline in the chat panel. So I apologize. If there are questions coming in, Jacqueline, feel free to transpose.
I'm going to. I was just going to say, if people put questions in the chat, I will move them over. So far, Jeannie did a great job of handling the few about pro formas and who does them, but I'll start moving them over.
Yes, thank you. So I thought that if you did in the Zoom chat, I'd be able to see it, but there's some funky thing going on. So I apologize for that. So it also allows us to comfortably navigate payroll, payables, meaning what we owe to our vendors and other people, and deposits that are coming in from sales. Grocery stores have a lot of inventory moving in and out, and a lot of payroll. That penny exercise, cost of goods and payroll was huge. We need a lot of cash always in the bank that we can rely on in order to run efficiently. And the greatest risk factor is opening undercapitalized. And that's my opinion, but I think a lot of my colleagues and a lot of startup co-ops would agree that we do not want to open undercapitalized. It makes it extremely difficult in that first year to meet the exciting, inspiring goals that we wanted to. And of course, we do need to make our debt payments on time. So there are principal debt payments that we are going to have to pay back to our lender, and we want to be prepared for that. And so if we're not going to generate earnings for a long time, we might have to have a big buffer of cash when we open to help start to pay back some of that debt, depending upon your schedule. Okay, so not to pick on any co-ops in particular, but here's a few torn from the page headline of co-ops. Maybe some of you know these folks who were startups that went into financial crisis early in the age or maturity of their business. Co-ops that had to seek a second round of funding in their first year of operations because they did not have enough capital. And I've spoken to some of these co-ops. I did a bunch of interviews as preparation for this, and everyone said, we opened undercapitalized. Creekside Co-op was in danger of closing before its 1-year anniversary, and it has since closed. They limped along for a long time, taking on more debt, but that one was a big blow to the co-op community. They simply had more debt than they could support by their sales. So we want to be going in the other direction. We'd rather be overcapitalized than undercapitalized. As part of those interviews, I've sort of capped some highlights from the folks that I spoke to. I spoke to some board members, general managers, and some consultants who've worked with multiple startups. We didn't keep up with the Performa, updating the Performa. And at the end, before we opened, we were saying, how much money do we have left? It was really like a question, a surprise right before they opened the doors. How much money do we have left? Somebody else said, we should have gone to the bank and the landlord right away when we realized that sales weren't what we expected, but we weren't focused on the long-term picture. We were just putting out fires. There's so much going on right when you open that you have to intentionally make the Performa and financial monitoring a goal, because it's so easy to get distracted. There's so much happening, good and crazy, and everyone's jumping in, trying to help the operation get on its feet. Somebody else said the accounting was a mess. The board didn't see updated financials for months after opening. By the time we started to get data, we had burned more cash than we ever anticipated. First few months is so critical, which is why we want to get those good accounting systems into place ahead of time so that we get the information that we need. It takes a lot of capacity to get those systems set up before opening. And then somebody else said, I remember sitting in meetings with our GM after opening, going line by line through the Performa, and I suddenly realized that they didn't really understand the document. It's a high bar to get comfortable managing a large project Performa. A lot of people, even seasoned managers from large corporate stores, have never had to do that before. Maybe there's people on your board that have never had any financial training. So we want to make sure that we are factoring that in. What's the experience level of our GM and our board with managing this document? And we're not just sort of all nodding our head and rubber stamping it. We need to understand the implications of the metrics. I am going to post my slides. I will post them after the session. I saw Kim, I saw your comment, so that's good. Okay, what happens when we don't hit Performa targets? Well, cash burn. We set our money on fire. By the time we realize it, we are way lower in the bank than what we wanted to be. And generally speaking, when you open the business, you're not in a good place to take on more debt. So if you burn your cash, you could only hope to replenish it pennies at a time through operations, and that's not going to happen after for a year or two. And you're leveraged to an extent that you're not attractive to a lender. So those few co-ops ripped from the headlines that had to do capital campaigns after opening, it's because they burned a lot of cash, and they were able to secure more money from their members. But keep in mind that member debt is almost always subordinate to outside conventional debt, meaning that if the business goes under, members would lose their money because they're not at the top of the stack, so to speak. The big guy, the big fish, gets the assets of the business, so they're less secure. We could violate loan covenants. So loan covenant is something that is written into your lender agreement that essentially it's a financial metric or a condition of your business that if you don't meet it, legally authorizes the lender to recall the value of your loan. And if you are violating a loan covenant, it's not just like semantics with your lender. Bankers are no dummies. It's not their first rodeo. And they know that if you start to veer off from performance against certain metrics, that they're less likely to get their investment back. That's why they watch those things very carefully. And then worst case scenario, there's no runway left. Your GM has just gone through a gauntlet. Your board has gone through a gauntlet of getting the store open. And if we don't have enough cash and we veer way off the pro forma, we might come to a situation where it's really hard to turn the ship around, so to speak. So we want to avoid getting there. I'm going to quickly sort of run you through one table, one outcome of the Performa document. And again, I adapted this from my colleague Don's work. So just to give him credit, he's the genius here, not me. I'm gonna get my pointer tool. Okay, so what we're looking at is the cash flow outcome of a project Performa. So let's say this is for a business that has not opened yet. They're basing their sales on their market study. All of these financial categories come from much more complex tabs of the spreadsheet. So they show up here as outcome. In year one, this business has a negative net income or negative pennies of about $450,000, $460,000. That's a lot in the first year, but it's quite common. Without depreciation, there's some adjustments here. Their negative cash flow from the operations is about $170,000. Negative cash flow from investments. But what I really want you to focus on is all the way down here at the bottom. So this is where the cash flow in the Performa is being projected out over a period of time. It's telling us as all these metrics, debt, reinvestment, net income, sales change either in our plan or in our actual results, what happens to the cash in the bank account? This is critically important. No cash, no co-op. So the Performa really hones all the way in here onto cash flow. This co-op started the year before they opened with about $350,000 in the bank. Whew, at the end of the year, they were down to $177,000. That was part of their plan, right? So they plan to burn cash. And if you, depending upon what stage your project in, you will likely plan to burn cash in the first year too. I got this closed captioning thing in the way. Oh, there we go. So in the second year, they started with that 177 and they burned some more cash, but their burn rate has slowed slightly as the business has matured and some of those opening expenses are behind them. And then in the third year, they're still burning, but now the cash burn has slowed to almost nothing. It's about they're almost cash neutral. Oh, they're getting close, right? They're down to 127. That's pretty low. But then we look at year 4 and we notice the business begins to build cash. And then from all the years projected into the future, the business is building cash. So this was likely a feasible Performa that indicated, yes, this works. We're going to burn cash for the first couple of years, but we're going to slow that burn rate over time. And then eventually we're going to start making cash. This is going to factor in all of their debt interest, their debt schedule, how quickly they expect sales to grow, like, etc. And now we're going to look at a different scenario. So let's say that this was the plan, and then we open, and reality doesn't match the plan, right? Because reality doesn't like being put in neat little spreadsheet boxes. It likes to challenge us a bit. So let's say that this co-op sales fall short 20%. Everything else stays the same for this example, except that sales are 20% lower. We still have the same expense, so our net income loss is increased. Let's take a look at cash flow. What happens? Well, we started with the same cash. We had $347 in the bank. That was like everything we raised. That was our member capital campaign. That was all of our equity that we worked so hard for. We ended the year at 134. Okay, we burned a little bit quicker than we did in the scenario we planned for. And now in year 2, we are down to $23,000 at the end of the year. That is getting into crisis mode for this business. By year 3, we are essentially out of business. Maybe we limp into year 4, but we're paying vendors late. We're not paying back our members' loan. We're upsetting our bank. Our staff are stressed out. Our GM's probably not sleeping through the night. And eventually we have negative cash, meaning that we owe more money than we have, right? So we're paying people late because we don't have any more money to pay them. And this is just a 20% difference in pro forma projection sales and actual sales. I wanted to just highlight this for you so you could see how quickly you could burn too much cash, right? We go from changing to profitability in year 4 and growing to being close to out of business in year 2. Oh yeah, sorry, I don't know why I said you can make it to year 4. I have the closed captioning thing in front of part of my spreadsheet here, but yeah, you're out of business in year 3 in this scenario. And so if anything, this is like a scared straight presentation on updating your Performa and paying attention to it. All right, so what are some common pitfalls that startups run into around Performa management? I've seen all of these things happen in different capacities. Many of them were brought up in the interviews that I did for this work. And I'll just say with empathy that it's hard, right? One of my colleagues was like, opening a store is easy, you know, or getting it open. It's everything else after that that is really hard. But that's likely not how you feel on the board, that it's hard now, right? You're doing a lot of hard work. But the point that was being made was that it doesn't end there. And without the support or the capacity of a large corporate organization that other big corporate grocery stores have available to them, it is a big lift to manage the Performa, to understand it, to communicate it to your volunteer board, to find a GM who can manage it. So just to acknowledge that it's not, you know, these weren't, you know, co-ops that weren't trying, right, that ended up with these pitfalls. It's actually quite easy to slip into these places without intention. So the intentionality is the key takeaway here. So common pitfall, I liked this picture. I can do it myself. Performa is an incredibly complex document. I'm a financial consultant and I don't create Performas because it requires a lot of expertise, both from an industry data perspective and also from a financial forecasting perspective. It's super comprehensive. I've seen co-ops sort of make their own Performas. The co-op I mentioned that forecasted a $200,000 profit in their first year. They did not get that profit. The Performa is like this sacred holy grail that we really want to maintain data integrity. So meaning that people that edit the Performa are trained and qualified to do that in their experience, and that those edits are tracked. I have worked with startup co-ops that were in crisis who had 6 versions of a Performa, didn't know who had changed what in what version. And it was almost like starting from scratch because we just didn't even know. Like reality was so far from the plan, and then the plan was so hard to even figure out what the plan was, right? We want to stay away from that scenario. So make sure you're qualified and that you have the right professional help. Step 1. Man, people are scared of big budgets. And so especially for the directors in this group, being really intentional about not rubber stamping or fearing the budget, fearing the Performa. It needs to be the framework for all decision making and a lot of the monitoring after 2A. So if you hit feasibility and you have an initial Performa, that thing, do not put it in a drawer and let it get dusty. It is the sort of guiding light for the rest of the project. I get that spreadsheets aren't sexy and they're not fun. Way more fun to focus on like member engagement and marketing and opening day and all the exciting, cool stuff that comes with opening a co-op. But we have to hold the Performa up in front of it all if we want those things to be sustainable. So don't be this lady hiding from the budget. I've seen it happen and I've been tempted to do it myself. Somebody in my interview said that when their board member from a startup co-op finally left the board, he was like, I'd be happy if I never heard the word Performa ever again, which makes me think they were doing a good job talking about it and tracking it. Another pitfall is not having comfort level with the Performa. It can feel like a fire, drinking from a fire hose of information. And so we need to be really realistic about getting people comfortable. It is not an afterthought. It's not an addendum to your project. It is the project. The Performa is the project. And so while people on your board certainly don't have to have a finance background, or, you know, be an expert in Excel, we want to be thinking about how to make this information accessible to the board and ensure that the GM has support to get comfortable with the project Performa, because you might have an awesome GM that you hire, but they don't have experience running a big capital project. It's not uncommon. I like this cartoon. Hi, I'm that bridge you said you were going to cross when you came to it. This is so common that people don't have a plan for who and how the Performa will get updated. And so maybe in pre-opening, before this door opens, your project manager or your GM, or maybe someone on the board, is tracking sources and uses. Meaning, here's the money's coming in, here's what we're spending on for construction, startup costs, etc. Once the store opens, that information becomes much more complex to track because it's coming out of our accounting system and it's linked to, you know, our time clock and our point of sale system and all of the vendor invoices that are going to start, like, you know, flowing into the business. And so have a plan between the board and the GM, however it's agreed on, how the Performa will be updated once the store opens. Because without it being updated with operating information, it is impossible for the board to understand, are we on track or off track? And one of the quotes that I had from my interviews was a co-op that said, like, our GM kept telling us our bookkeeping was messed up. And so we had no idea what was happening in those first couple months. Plan ahead so that doesn't happen. Most startups cannot afford a finance manager. So most startups, we're not opening $10 million startups. I mean, maybe, but it's rare. And so most small grocery stores will not have a ton of finance capacity. Consider where this capacity is going to come from. Is it the board? Is it your GM who feels supporting you? Not having good data, right? This is connected sort of to that story from the co-op of we didn't know what we didn't know. Our GM kept saying the accounting system isn't ready. We can't figure it out. Things are booked in the wrong category. We don't know what expense is what expense. It's a lot of work to set up an accounting system for a grocery store. It's a lot of work to set up an accounting system for any business that has a 1% profit margin. We really need all the categories solid, your bookkeeper trained, good internal financial controls. So in the startup monitoring period, where maybe your board is like trying to transition to policy governance, you're doing all of this stuff related to the opening of the business, maybe you're tabling and, you know, all the things that are going on, exciting around the business, make sure your board has prepared for holding the GM accountable to accurate financial data on day one. I've been a GM who's opened a store before. There are 1,001 things to do. Everything is like happening at the same time. You're trying to get everything, smash it all in the same timeline to get the door open. It is easy to make accounting systems an afterthought, but it is the riskiest time in the life of your business is the couple months after the doors open. So sit down with your GM and make sure that you guys have discussed the plan, both for the transition of accounting from the board to operations and for operations internally to run accurate financial statements and to have accurate bookkeeping. Consider potentially getting a professional to help you set up your general ledger. General ledger is just the order of accounts in your QuickBooks or your accounting system. One of the GMs I spoke to said, oh my gosh, if we could have imported the budget from the Proforma and lined it all up in QuickBooks, that would have saved me like hours and, you know, tons of gray hairs right off my head. So think really carefully about how you're going to use the Proforma document to compare actual against budget. And then make sure that we keep the Performa current. So again, those first couple months, there's so much to do. how is the Performa going to be updated, and making sure that the GM is held accountable to the board for keeping that information up to date. Otherwise, it is almost impossible to know whether our business is a success or not. It's going to feel like a success when you open that door on the front day, but if in first day, but if in 6 months you've burned through all your cash, you might be this guy sitting at the desk being, what do you mean? Right? What do you mean we're sinking? I had no idea. So it's critically important that this document stays alive and fresh. So it's not static. You might find, and you will likely find, as I said, reality doesn't like to follow our plans all the time, that once you open, there are things that need adjusting in the plan. And it is important that we keep the Performa as a living document and be prepared to course correct. If reality does not match the plan, we have to come back to the table and retool our plan, potentially with some professional help if we're depending upon how far off course or from what financial metric is veering off of Performa plan. And so the example of the cash flow that I showed you was an example of a co-op that didn't do anything differently or didn't course correct fast enough when they realized sales were 20% lower than planned. And so being really on top of any changes or need to sort of come up with a different solution. Along those same lines, being really proactive about engaging your lenders and or your landlord if you see critical differences between Performa and actual once the doors open. The co-ops that I've had experience with that got very close to crisis, or in the case of Creekside, actually closed, was a terrible shame. I worked with Creekside and I had a lot of passion for that project, is that we didn't go to the lender fast enough. The lender wants their money back, especially, I mean, a lot of you are probably going to work with organizations that are community lenders or values-driven lenders. They want your project to be successful. Your debt structure is based on the operation producing a certain amount of net income that's impacted by sales and expense, and opening with the right amount of cash, right? If we don't open with the right amount of cash, then our plan to lose money for the first 2 or 3 years might put us out of business because we didn't open with the right number. So there's 2 things that can really way throw that off track. If there's critical differences, if we're not opening with the right amount of money, or if sales are way off, I would be on the horn with my lender right away, because what lenders do not want is a surprise. And I think sometimes there's a pride or we're afraid to go back to the lender or the landlord, but it is really critical, particularly for your lender, because they want their investment back. We need to be in partnership together to ensure that the feasibility of our plan ensures mutual success and achievement, right? And so do not wait until you are in crisis to approach your lender or to name that you are way off track. Some of the co-ops that I interviewed did wait until they were in crisis, and they are lucky to have some supportive lenders that really are trying their best to work with the co-op. But it would have been much more successful if they had had those conversations earlier on, potentially looked at deferring principal payments, potentially refinance, whatever it is, reducing releasing some money that you have had to put in escrow, whatever it is. There's potentially some leverage there that your lender could provide for you. And I just really liked this comic. My grandma, what crushing debt you have. And that is the case in most of the startups that I have seen struggle. The debt feels really, really high if sales didn't hit projection or we didn't open with enough cash. Suddenly your debt that was manageable as part of the 10-year Performa is no longer manageable. And it kills me when I see an excited GM of a brand new co-op having to worry about paying debt payments when that money should be used for marketing, right? And engaging your membership and all that fun stuff. So how will the board know if the business is on track or off track? I don't recommend bringing a 8-page spreadsheet to the board meeting and just having everybody go at it, right? So there has to be some system that we have thought through that makes this information digestible for the board. I don't know of any simplistic templates that are out there for this purpose, but maybe that'll be some follow-up work I'll think about after this session. If anybody has any good resources or examples of how your board is tracking the Performa, definitely put those into the chat panel. Will it just be a finance committee or a treasurer that meets with the GM and helps interpret that back to the whole board? Will the GM report like a dashboard of pro forma budget to actual? What is the plan for monitoring? Being really intentional about that before the doors open and setting clear expectations with your GM is critical, because your GM is going to be running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and setting the expectation that this financial reporting has to happen is really going to be important, because they're getting pulled in every direction. All right, and here's just some notes on financial information. So I heard from one of my interviews that the GM kept saying everything's fine, and that's the type of reporting the board was getting. So making sure that we have the data to support the opinion, that we have numbers in context to our Performa. You could tell me I have $138,992 in the bank. Cool. I don't know if that means we're out of business next year or not. You need the context of those Performa metrics to understand if we're on track or if we're in the manhole, like our oblivious backpack guy. And if we are not on track, being really intentional about the plan for correcting course. I just sort of screen capped some of the top line metrics that are being projected in your Performa or tracked in your Performa. So how many days of cash we have, how much working capital, that's that buffer in the bank, how much profit or loss, our earnings from operation, and then those really important debt ratios, a current ratio, debt to equity, and debt service coverage ratio, which is one that you might find a lender has a covenant requirement for. So it's simple enough maybe to work it into a dashboard, but making sure that your co-op has really thought through the process of how we're going to look at it once the store opens. Now, if you are a policy governance co-op or you plan to be a policy governance co-op, typically for an open and operating store, we look at financial metrics in depth once a quarter. And that might not be enough for a startup. So just keeping in mind that if you are transitioning to a policy governance calendar, that in the interim period, maybe the first 3 or 6 months of the business, I reckon, this is my personal opinion, that you should be looking at financial metrics, key financial metrics from the Performa every month, like just so we all have the same visual of on trackness or off trackness, so to speak. Okay, so that was the sort of gamut run of all of the ways that I've seen the Performa fall by the wayside. If you take anything from this session, let it be that it requires intentionality to make the Performa the guide for your project. Without the Performa as the guide for your project, your level of risk goes through the roof. And you know, we are fiduciaries for our member assets, for the vision of the business. And so the feasibility, the comprehensiveness of the Performa document really ensures that we're taking our member capital and that we're doing what we said we were going to do with it. We do not want to burn our member capital, right? We want to be able to leverage it for return on investment in our ends and our community and all the good stuff that our co-ops plan to do. So as a quick recap, and then we'll have some time for questions. I know I've just been like powering through your stuff. Get professional help in the creation of your Performa, and make sure that you have a system for maintaining the integrity of data. I'm sure there's startup horror stories of 100 Performa versions and nobody knows which one is the right one. Seen it. It's the forefront of all decision making, so everybody needs to be really comfortable, both board and GM. And maybe there's like 1 or 2 people on the board that go way deeper into spreadsheet world, but at least everyone needs to understand that as a fiduciary, we need to know the top line outcomes that are critical. Make sure there's a plan for how it will get updated once the store is open. I have seen co-ops hire a GM like really late in the game or make a GM change before opening, and then that person's running the store, and then all of a sudden this giant thing gets dumped on their lap, like update this. And so just making really clear what the expectations and communication are around the document itself. Talking with your GM about strong accounting systems day one. It's not easy to do. It takes a lot of preparation, and you might want to get professional help in setting up your accounting systems, because the organization of your accounting systems is critically important to the success of the business and to the board's ability to monitor the business. If there's big changes in the plan, or maybe medium changes, and we have to retool the plan, don't delay, right? If there's construction overruns, or the store is taking 6 months longer to open because we need some part that we don't have, or we can't, a store that I opened, we couldn't get the electric company to finish installing our 3-phase electricity. So we literally had to delay opening for weeks, waiting for the electric company to come make the final connection so our fridges would work. There's all kinds of funky stuff that could come up, making sure that those things are being continually updated. As soon as it's clear you're significantly off track, don't put your head in the sand. It's tempting to do, especially because you're so tired and you're like, we're at the summit, I'm ready to relax and go on vacation. Be vigilant and reach out directly to your lender as soon as you need to. And then lastly, not least, as a board, have a governance plan for that period right before opening and right after opening, maybe before you're transitioning into full annual policy governance reporting, if you're going that direction, for how you're going to monitor the impacts of reality versus the pro forma. And this is not uploaded yet, but I'll upload it right after our session, and there's a recording as well if folks want access to the slide deck and want to take it back to the rest of your board and scare them about the pro forma. Feel free. Okay, so I suspect that I have not been seeing the chat panel and that there's potentially some other stuff that has come in there. So I'm going to stop screen sharing in the hopes that I'll be able to see your questions, potentially in the other Zoom window. We have about 15 minutes left. All right, I'm going to refresh my passable window because I still don't see any questions. Another thing that I think you could do if you have a question potentially is to take yourself off or to raise your hand, and I can take you off mute. What should we expect to pay for a professional Performa process? Great question. My colleague, Don Moffat, who has done some other presentations at this conference, I think he's presenting right now at the same time, would be the best person to ask for that, because I don't want to speak for him. But what you pay, here's what I will say, what you pay for a market study and what you pay for a Performa are excellent investments. Because the entire feasibility of your project relies on these two documents. And like I said, you won't get a loan from a conventional lender without a pro forma. So I think all said and done, maybe market study and pro forma, maybe you expect to spend, between $15,000 and $20,000 for both of those things. That's a big generalization. Maybe some other folks that have had pro formas done could chime in here as to what it costs their co-op. But yeah, they're critical parts of the process. It's typically like the first big expense that we spend money on. All right. Anybody else? I see one hand up. Let's see who that is. I'm going to allow you to talk, Catherine, and you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi, this is Kathy Nash, Prairie Food Co-op. We are in stage 2B, I guess. And so right now it's really critical that our pro forma is accurate and then our entire board understands it and can make decisions off of it. And so what kind of training is available to startup board members on kind of like you just did for this presentation, and who does that training?
It's a good question. I would definitely, whoever created your pro forma would be a good first place to start, having them walk through the pro forma with the group and doing some formalized training. My colleague Leslie and I also do a financial training for directors. That's part of our cooperative board leadership development program, if you are a member of that through Illuminate. And Leslie and I have been running that program 3 or 4 times a year. We have another session scheduled in August, and that is more, it's less pro forma specific, but we cover all of the important financial metrics that are tracked through your pro forma. So things like debt to equity, liquidity, all those solvency ratios, et cetera, are part of that training and how they're incorporated into an annual budgeting process. So that's one thing I can think of off the top of my head. We also have one of my colleagues, Audrey Griffin, is a CPA. She's really great. Don's really great. Certainly I could assist with some training like that. And if anybody has good resources that have been helpful for your board, definitely drop those into the chat panel as well. All right. Anybody else with questions, feel free to put your hand up. We have a couple more minutes. I'm happy to answer anything that's on your mind about pro formas or startup finance. And if you're wondering how to raise your hand, if you hover over your name in the participant panel, you should be able to do so, and I can allow you to unmute yourself. Thanks, Tony, for coming. So sorry that some folks got booted off and we had that connection problem up front. Appreciate you all hanging in there with me while we figured that out. I see someone else commenting, understanding that opening day is not the summit. Yeah, I know, it would be great, right, if opening day was the summit, and it feels like that, but it really is base camp. Okay, well, we have about 15 folks still on the line. I mean, I know somebody's got a question. I'm going to go through and just allow people to talk in case that is more encouraging, but you'll still have to unmute yourself if you want to chime in and ask a question, but I'm at least going to set it up so you have the power.
Is somebody gonna start asking questions? Because I'll tell you, I'm not even supposed to be here. This is Jacqueline, and that was amazing. And I will start asking questions that you all don't.
Please do.
Because I think there's a lot of good questions coming up about, like, oh my God, there's someone saying here, like, is there a book we should be reading right now about what you just shared? And, you know, I think a lot of boards heard this and panicked a little. Where would you encourage them to start and orient themselves toward this when it wasn't on their horizon?
Yeah, sorry, I think that's my tendency, is to doom and gloom. I want to like scare everyone into like understanding the importance of the Performa. So hopefully I didn't freak everybody out too much. But a good place to start is just getting really familiar as a board with where you are in your process. So I think the Performa can feel a little bit exasperating after a while because there's lots of versions, right? Version 1, version 2, version 3, we tweak this, we tweak that, we tweak that. But just getting the group really comfortable with all of the parts that make up the Performa. I saw somebody, you know, or maybe that was Jacqueline, giving like, yeah, thumbs up to Don doing great board-wide training on what it is. I think there's potentially some good articles in the Cluminate library about how Performa is used for project management, and some market study context there as well that I know has been helpful for boards. I'm not aware of any booklet. Jacqueline, I don't know if you are. I mean, yeah.
I think that at some point Brittany and I and some others need to talk, because I think there's a gap here. So I agree with you. I don't think it exists.
Totally. Yeah, and that's sort of what inspired the framework for the session. Jacqueline and I were just like throwing stuff at the wall, talking about this period of time where the co-op is, there's so much going on and everything's changing and transitioning, that there really is sort of a gap in the transition of like the board holding some financial and operational pieces, the operations holding it, and getting the Performa updated with real data once the store opens. And so I think that, yeah, there's an opportunity there for us to continue to develop resources around this period.
Did you see the question that came in?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the live plan that automates numbers for you and creates a Performa? I've never heard of it before. Have you, Jacqueline?
No, but I'm gonna say, because I get to say it because she's with Illuminate, that no. I've watched, this is one place that I'm going to tell you every time, spend the money as somebody who has the expertise in your industry. We do have a sources and uses training tool on FCI's website that Don had input on and Stuart did. That will teach you how to fill out a basic sources and uses and where those numbers come from. And that's a terrific beginning training tool.
Mm-hmm.
But when you need to get to the real thing, I'm going to second Brittany. This is not a place to mess around.
Yeah. It requires a lot of deep financial and spreadsheet work that I don't even have the stomach for. But glad to hear that, I think it was Tony, that you have had some at least positive experiences with some other resources for that. I'd totally encourage you to check out Don's resources and recordings from his presentations at the conference if you haven't already. Jerry, do you have a question?
Well, I guess it's a question. I'm just looking for the clarification on it. Sometimes the pro forma seems to have very subjective information, sometimes very objective information. Since it's a working live tool, how are the resolutions made in there? When you have different points of view rather than a hard fact on something. And I also have a second one, and that becomes, how many true experts do you really need on a pro forma? Because we're, as Kathy stated, if we're in a planning stage, you can try to get everybody up to speed, but I still think there might be, I don't know, is it 1, 2, 3 people that are true deep dive knowledgeable people?
Really great question. And so I will just sort of give my non-Performa expert, but I've worked a lot of Performa expert insight into like where the assumptions and actuals come into play. So the first big assumption that you settle on in your project is sales. Sales determines everything else, right? It determines how much debt we can take on, how much expense we're going to have, how much money we need to raise, what size, building, those things kind of work alongside each other, the size of the building and the sales potential. So one of the major assumptions in the Performa comes from a market study, which would be like a different professional who has technical expertise in market study data. So that's one thing that truly is an assumption until you open the doors. And so that's one place that we want to pay close attention to. The session that Don is doing now, or that recorded earlier, is focused on translating your specific vision into the Performa. As I kind of broke out in my presentation, there's not a lot of variation in what co-ops are able to achieve on the bottom line. Like, co-ops make between 1% and 2% of sales, and anybody making more than that is really an outlier in the data set. And that's data that is solid, aggregated data from hundreds of co-ops and years of sort of financial results that we are able to measure that. So the fact that best case we can expect a 1% or 2% profit being generated from the business means that there is some room to play with how we are thinking about and budgeting for these other metrics. Like, what's our labor going to be? Are we going to have a living wage? I really encourage you to look at Don's session, because these are the types of questions he's talking about in his visioning part. But I've worked with co-ops that said, you know, we want to pay everyone $20 an hour and we want to beat the prices at Dollar Store or Walmart. And Don's job, or a Performa professional's job, whoever you're working with, is to plug that all in and show it to you. And oftentimes the first couple versions of the Performa are not positive. Like, this doesn't work, right? Back to the drawing table. So in the visioning process of initial Performa creation, there's a lot of assumption built into there. In fact, the only real numbers we settle on in those early stages come when we start locking in capital. Like, we're definitely going to have this much capital at this interest rate or whatever, or this much outside funding, or we've done some pre-construction or planning work and we know how much our equipment is going to cost, etc. Up until that point, a lot of it is experiential assumptions. Like, here's how much you could expect to spend if you have a vanilla shell building on leasehold improvements. I don't know that answer, right? And you would rely on your market study professional to talk you through how they have gotten to each of these assumptions in startup and in operating costs. I don't know if that totally answered your question, Jerry, but it's not as simple. Like,
right. No, I get that. And
what was the second part?
The second part was really just getting into, you know, if you had a financial lead,
yeah. How many people?
What kind of backup, or how many people really do you feel really need to be in the trenches on a Performa, working Performa?
I think typically it's 1 to 2 or 3. If you're including the Performa professional, your general manager, and, you know, somebody from the board, maybe 2 people from the board. But one of the things that was really clear from the interviews that I did, and this one in particular was with a board member, that this co-op made like a dashboard of all of the key Performa metrics. There's likely something like that in your existing file, but you could make it into visual. That was really helpful. So baseline, I think all board members need financial training, because they're going to be monitoring the financial outcomes of the business. So that's things like understanding the 3 financial statements roughly, right? We don't have to, like, you know, have an accounting degree, but what they represent, what liquidity and solvency metrics mean, what kind of earnings we can expect from the business. I'm always surprised when I work with the co-op when the board doesn't realize it's going to be a 1% profit margin business. So some people think when you open the door, it's going to be like gangbusters cash, but that's really not the case. So I think having, you know, maybe 2 to 4 people, depending upon the capacity of your team, or if you have a finance manager, it just depends in your operation, going deep into the Performa and then helping to interpret that back in a really clear way to the rest of the group who has a baseline like training.
Great. That answers it. Thank you.
All right, so we are coming up just on the 2:30 time. I'll just maybe do one last ask if anybody has any questions. Now we have a little bit of buffer on the room here. All right, so seeing no other hands, I just want to thank all of you guys for being here with me today. Really excited for all the startup work that you're doing, and I hope your Performa brings you to the top of Everest, so to speak. I'm going to upload this presentation today. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out to me directly, and check out Don's work, because some of the vision questions you'll find really interesting information in his sessions. Okay, great. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you, Brittany.
Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, Jacqueline, for all your help.